I'm very honoured to be speaking to you all today about my own journey and the challenges I face, particularly as a culturally diverse woman in corporate law. So I am a corporate lawyer with 15 years experience, basically practicing, advising on some of the largest corporate transactions across Australia. In addition to that, I have, as part of my career journey, become a very strong advocate in seeing greater culturally representation of culturally diverse, particularly culturally diverse women, particularly at the top end of the sort of corporate law and professional services sectors. So I will just talk a little bit about my journey and the challenges that I've faced and some of the lessons that I've learnt along the way. I think to start, I'll talk about my background and how being Asian and female has impacted me in my journey so far. So when I first started as a corporate lawyer, the issue of cultural diversity was never contemplated in the Australian legal profession. But for me, my Asian heritage has been a factor that I've been acutely aware of since I was very young, and it has impacted my journey to this very day. So you can guess that with a surname of Nguyen, my background is Vietnamese, and I was born in a refugee camp in Indonesia, a camp on the island of Galang, where I believe Lyma spent some time there too. And I arrived in Australia when I was 6 months old as a baby, with my parents, who were part of the Vietnamese boat people who left Vietnam after the war. We settled in the western suburbs of Melbourne, and that's essentially where I grew up and have lived for the bulk of my life. So growing up, for those of you who are from Melbourne, you know that the western suburbs of Melbourne is quite a multicultural, diverse community area of Melbourne. And so growing up in the western suburbs, I was generally comfortable, at least psychologically comfortable in terms of my cultural heritage, socially comfortable. Like I said, the western suburbs, it was very much a melting pot of cultures. And so pretty much everyone I grew up with, went to school with, or interacted with in my early years growing up were from a migrant family. And so we all came from different places, whether that was, Vietnam, Malta, Italy, the Philippines, and so forth. But we all shared this one common bond, and that was that we were all different, and we were all from a, I suppose, cultural minority and not sort of part of the mainstream Anglo-Saxon society that you would typically seen on television and the like at the time. But that also said, there was also one other thing. There was no kind of majority race, or ethnicity or culture that was in play when I was growing up. So we were all minorities, but we were all equal minorities, and so we were bound and united by our difference, I guess. And so I was acutely aware of my cultural heritage growing up, and I was comfortable with that, being in the western suburbs and having that environment. And that was a bit of a bubble for me. Outside of that western suburbs bubble, I didn't have that same sense of comfort and security about my cultural background. When you look in the sort of mainstream of, what is portrayed to be as Australia, I didn't see people who looked like me. I didn't see anyone who I could have some sort of affinity with that could connect me with Australia. And I think this became even more acute as I moved into my formative years as a teenage, in my formative teenage years. And this was at the time when the Asian immigration debate was ramping up. For those of you who might remember, Pauline Hanson had basically sprung into Parliament and launched her maiden speech that essentially said, Australia was being swamped by Asians, and the problems that Australia were facing were caused by this influx of Asian immigration into Australia. And at that time, it was very much Asians like myself, sort of Southeast sort of Asians. And that for me had a really profound impact, because at that point, when you're in your 12, 13, 14, you're trying to figure out who you are, you're trying to figure out your place in this country. You've grown up in Australia, and yet at the same time there's someone, a fellow Australian, who's basically saying you don't belong here. And so that really puts a lot of question and doubt in and insecurity, and certainly that did that in my mind about my place in the Australian society. If I didn't belong to Australia or in Australia, where did I belong, given that that was the only place that I knew to be my home? And so I think for many years I struggled with this I suppose this tension and this insecurity. And so, in a lot of ways, like Lyma talked about, I really struggled with shame and embarrassment and sort of, just shame and embarrassment about being Asian. I didn't want people to see me. I didn't want people to, identify me or call me out as Asian. I didn't want to accept that I was Asian. And it was really because that was my method of self-preservation and protecting against that fear that I was going to be singled out. I was going to be subject to a lot of the racism that was happening at the time. And so for me, that altered and that impacted the way I behaved. And those sorts of, that impact continues to stay ingrained in me, has stayed and has been ingrained in me for a long time. And so, at that time, it was very much, let's stay hidden, let's keep your head down, let's not make a big fuss, let's not celebrate the successes, let's not do anything to draw attention to yourself. And so having that kind of attitude meant that I took that into my career as a corporate lawyer. And certainly as a young corporate lawyer, that's the approach that I took. Heads down, bum up, don't draw attention to yourself. And that, for me, as a Asian female corporate lawyer in an environment where my clients, my counterparts, my superiors, and basically the majority of people that I would work with would be private school, white males of a middle age. And so, it really impacted. So being in that environment and then having those insecurities about my own Asianness perpetuated my insecurities and as a result enhanced that kind of adverse sort of behaviour in terms of not trying to, be noticed and the like. I think that was even more so as I became more senior, though. I realised that culture was one element that can be an inhibitor to progression, and that for a large part that was me and my own perceptions and on my own insecurities. As I moved up through the ranks, on top of the insecurities around being Asian, the glass coating of the female, my femaleness came into play. And so as you move up through the ranks, you start to try and build credibility, you try and build reputation, you try and build, a line of work and a reputation. And being female and Asian, which is something that you don't typically see in corporate law, that really, you start to then see a lot of the unconscious biases coming through from counterparts. I would be on major transactions and I would be the only, in many regards, I would be the only female and only Asian sitting around the table trying to negotiate, complex multi-million-dollar transactions. It's very hard to create the gravitas and the credibility when you're already in an environment where the perception and the expectation of a female Asian is not one that sort of accords with what I was having to behave in and having to do. So that was a real challenge for me in terms of how do I break through that? How do I instill confidence in my clients, and how do I achieve a fulfilling career, but still being sort of true to who I was and my ethnicity and my femaleness. And so I think it's taken many years. It takes I think a lot of the things that Lyma had talked about in terms of having that leap of faith, looking at your weaknesses as advantages and trying to bring those sort of different diverse views. That has helped me over the years to really build the confidence to sort of to be in this environment, which is very alpha, very male, and still to be able to succeed in that environment. One of the things I have certainly learned as part of my journey is, and being in this minority kind of female and Asian, one of the things I learned was you need to get comfortable with being uncomfortable. So many times, I've been in, situations where, there are things, I'm sitting in there with people that I don't connect with. There are people who just see me as some little junior person who's there to take the coffee orders or, take the notes. And so there's an element of how do I sort of break through that? And so there is a level of discomfort that, an awkwardness that needs to sort of overcome in those situations. And so over time, I've learnt that you just can't, there are going to be a lot of those situations where it's going to be uncomfortable. So for me, I've learned to let go of that and just go, okay, well, that's the situation I'm in. I'm going to get comfortable with that, and I'm going to do the best I can in the situation that I'm put forth. There is an element to that in terms of being able to get comfortable with being uncomfortable. For me, being able to learn that that's okay requires a lot of support from, what I call my personal cheerleaders, peers, mentors who I can turn to for support on those days where I need that psychological lift, whether it's to vent about, a situation that's happened, or to look for advice, or to give some perspective, and sometimes even give you that kick in reality. It's really, one of the things that's really powerful, and certainly has been really powerful for me, is having that group of people who really are the core to my sort of psychological well-being. Certainly, in addition to that, the exercise, the eating well, the looking after yourself. And, I have to say, as much as I preach that, I'm probably guilty of not doing enough of it. And we, I think when you're brought up to be a bit of a perfectionist and have very high standards, that comes with a bit of a self-sacrificing, I've got to worry about other people before worrying about myself. But there is definitely a real importance in looking after, number one, because you can't look after everyone else unless you're psychologically and physically well. I think second to that is, and I've sort of touched on it, is authenticity. And Lyma also touched on it. It's, for me, when I started to realise that I can't change who I am, I can't change the fact that I'm a small Asian female in corporate law, and I just have to do things my way, things became a lot easier. The way I operated, the way I got through my work, the way I interacted with people, it got a whole heap easier. I think for a long time, certainly in the early parts of my career, I spent a long time trying to fit in, trying to be one of the boys, trying to find something that made me part of the boys' club. But the reality was, that's just not going to happen. And so once I accepted that I am who I am, and and the best person that I can be is who I can authentically be, everything else became a lot easier. And I wasn't fighting, the system. I was just working through the system in my unique way. And so I think, my advice to this group is, really think about who are you? What do you believe in? What do you stand for? What drives you? Because that makes your life a whole heap easier as you face through the different barriers and the different challenges. But it also creates a brand in you and how people perceive you. And so if you can deliver that in a clear and consistent way, that becomes you and your strengths and how people perceive you, and all those other stereotypical perceptions, sort of fall away. The other thing that the other lesson that I've learned is along the way is the importance of investing in relationships and networks. And this is something that, as an Asian, growing up with very traditional parents, it is not a value, and it is not a piece of advice that is instilled from a young age. For me, it was something that I only learned as I progressed through my career. When I reflect on my own career journey and how I've come to where I've come, I don't think I could have achieved what I've achieved without the support of my networks. And that's from my sponsors who have pulled me up and lifted me, mentors, as well as, other people and stakeholders who sort of play into the things that I'm doing. And, many years ago, I got to this point in my career where I was like, I don't fit in this corporate law environment. The people that I deal with, I feel like I don't belong. And I was desperate to find somewhere where I could at least feel some sort of affinity to. And so at the time I joined the Asian Australian Lawyers Association, which had just started. It had all of 10 members. And I thought, I'm going to connect with that because at least, there's an affinity there. They're Asians, they're like me, at least that's one less thing I've got to, I have to worry about. So I joined the Asian Australian Lawyers Association purely just to find a group where I could at least connect with. And from that, I got myself very much involved in the work of the Asian Australian Lawyers Association, whose core purpose is to promote and advocate for Asian Australian representation in the senior ranks of the legal profession. And I really developed a passion through that time and through the work of the Asian Australian Lawyers Association in understanding the issue of the lack of representation and cultural diversity in the legal profession, and then to really taking an active part in shifting the dial on that. And at that time, I think I mentioned earlier, cultural diversity was not an area of diversity that anyone had even contemplated. But through the work of the Asian Australian Lawyers Association, we have been able to put that issue on the agenda. And I threw myself in there and eventually became the national president of that association. And that was simply from this desire to build a network. And so for me, the lesson I learned from that is if you invest in those networks, it's amazing where those networks can take you. So I've gone from the Asian Australian Lawyers Association. I've now moved into taking over as head of the PwC's National Cultural Diversity Network. I've been involved with the Asian Australian Leadership Summit and the Centre for Asian Australian Leadership with Jieh-Yung, and done a whole host of wonderful things, really, and meeting some wonderful people, just to supporting and promoting and pushing for change, to creating an environment that is truly inclusive and truly representative. So it is so crucial that having and investing in those relationships, is very much, a core skill that you need and a core focus of your progression. And I think for me, the last thing is, it sort of goes to Lyma's point, support each other, speak up, find, the biases, the barriers, the challenges, they're going to be there regardless of what our environment looks like. So have the courage to speak up, look for those opportunities to make the environment that we're working in a better environment, and support each other. Yes, it is a competitive environment in all of our professional fields, but I think if we support each other and help each other to bring the best up and speak up against the injustices and the inequalities, we can create an environment and a working environment that everyone can thrive, and that's only going to be good for everyone. So that's kind of the few tips I've got in my, I think, more than 10 minutes. So I'm going to hand back to Judy.
Thank you so